This video is a review of the Niner Rip 9. I've had this bike for about 4 months and have ridden it on a lot of trails here in Florida and in the mountains of North Georgia. And I wanted to do a review, not as someone who works for a bike shop or a bike company or a magazine, but as someone who's kind of an everyday rider. And this is a bike that's really been reviewed a lot in magazines and on internet sites. And this is the Mountain Bike Action September edition that just came out, September 2011. They got a really good review on this bike. But I wanted to give my perspective, and the way I want to do this is gear it not just for the Niner Rip 9, but for longer travel 29ers, which I believe are really just starting to find their place in the market. And 29ers have really developed the same way that 26ers have developed. When 26ers first came out, everything was a hardtail rigid, and then they got 80 millimeter travel forks, and eventually those forks grew to 100, and then full suspension got popular and was really tweaked so that it was efficient. Today, a 140 millimeter travel 26er is pretty much standard for a trail bike, and 100 millimeters full suspension 26ers are standard for a race bike. 29ers have kind of evolved the same way. When they first came out, everything was a hardtail with an 80 millimeter travel fork. Then those forks grew a little bit, and then full suspension really started to come on the scene. And so today, most full suspension 29er race bikes are now 100 millimeters of travel. And so right now we're in this evolution of seeing the longer travel 29ers really get a lot of traction in the marketplace. Over the past few years, I've owned a bike that's dedicated for cross-country racing, and then a second bike is a trail bike. And when I got into 29ers last year, I kind of debated on whether or not I really needed to do that, because my race bike is a Giant Anthem X 29er, and 29er full suspensions make really good trail bikes as well as really good race bikes. But what I was able to do by getting a second bike as a trail bike is build it really beefy and take it pretty far away from that cross-country race bike, because there are some trails that I ride that I would not want to ride a Giant Anthem X. I'd be compromising the bike and it wouldn't be as fun. On the same token, I definitely wouldn't want to race a trail bike. So by having two bikes, I'm able to really keep them separate for different riding styles and different trails. So let me start off by going through how I have this bike set up, and real briefly how I have the Giant Anthem X set up, so you can see the differences. Alright, so this Rip 9 is a 2011 frame, and for 2011 Niner just slackened the head angle out, I think about half a degree, which is the only real change that they've made. This is a small size frame. I'm 5'8", and this frame fits me very well. I test rode a medium Niner and it just felt too big. My Anthem is actually a medium, and so the Niner bikes run a little bit bigger than most of the other manufacturers. So take that into consideration if you're considering one. If you're right on the border between sizes, I would recommend for a Rip 9 going to the smaller size, because this bike is designed to handle some pretty rough terrain and be more playful, and so you don't need to be stretched out like you do on a cross-country bike. I think you can handle it a lot better if you don't go with a bike that's maybe just a little bit too big. So again, go down a size if you're thinking about one and you're on the border. This is set up with a 2x10 drivetrain. I've got a SRAM X9 front derailleur and a SRAM XO rear derailleur, and this actually has a bash guard on it, but it's a 2x10, and I would highly recommend a 2x10 for this bike. I've read some forum posts where people get some chain suck issues with 3 chain rings on the front. I can't validate those claims or concerns, but I do know it works really well with a 2x10. The only reason I would ever recommend going with 3 chain rings in the front is if you just already have the components. But if you're buying new, the 2x10 stuff is just really, really good. So looking at the shocks, it's got an RP23, which what Niner specs on the bike, and I'll point out some differences between this and the Giant, like I mentioned earlier. But This bike, even though it only has a ½ inch more travel, is considerably more plush than the Giant Anthem X29er. And the reason I think it is because this is a longer stroke shock, and because of that, I think it just feels more linear and feels like it goes deeper into its travel. And on the front, I've got a Fox Talus 120. This is also 2011 fork. And this fork is perfect for this bike because this bike gets a ton of traction and you can go up some pretty steep hills. And when you do that, it's really nice to dial down that fork down to 95. Just flick the lever, the travel adjust lever, down to 95, just like that, and it lowers the front end for climbing. And that really gives you some control on the climbs. And then of course for the descents and any other trail, flatter trails, I keep it at 120. And it feels really balanced with the 120. Personally, I will only use a Fox fork. I've had a lot of Fox forks over the years, a few other manufacturers, and the Fox forks just give me the best reliability and the best performance. And so I had considered a 140 when I built this bike, but at that time Fox did not have a 140. So I went with the 120. Now for 2012, Fox is making a really sweet 34mm stanchion 140 Talus and a 29er. And it's something that I'd be interested in, but because this is a small frame and I'm only 5'8", the 140 I think would put me up a little bit too high. Doesn't mean that I don't want to try it, but I think the 120 for me is going to be a really good length for this bike. Okay, so just looking at a few more things on this bike, I've got the Maxxis Ardent tires, and I love these tires. They corner really well, they roll really smoothly, and when you're going into a corner, they don't flop into a corner like some other tires do. They transition really well, and they have a ton of grip. And so because I have a cross-country bike, a race bike, I'm able to go pretty beefy on the Rip 9. So I put a 2.4 on the front and a 2.25 on the back. And I really like this combination. These are set up tubeless with the ZTR Flow rims. And I considered one of the narrower rims from Stan's, but again, because I'm able to go real beefy on this bike, I went with the Flow rim, just so I didn't have to worry about bending the rim on really rough terrain or some jumps. For the brakes, I've got the Avid Elixir CR SLs, and I put a 180 rotor on the front, and I've got the 160 on the back, and I really like the 180 on the front for riding in the mountains. There's some long descents, long steep descents that I do, and the 180 works really well. For the handlebar, I've actually got a riser bar on this bike. I don't like flat bars. I think with the riser bar, I get more feel and more control, and that's a personal preference. But because I have a riser, I flip the stem, and I really like running the riser bar even on a longer travel 29er, and I don't feel like I'm sitting up too high. And to finish it up, I've got a Thompson seat post and a Specialized saddle. As far as the weight of the bike, it's right at 29.5 pounds, and as you saw from going over the components, I don't have any real sickly light components on it. And of course I still have the pedals on, with the Shimano XT pedals. This is my Giant Anthem X29er. I just real briefly want to show some differences that I'm able to do on this bike versus the Rip 9. I've got a 1x10 on this, and I really like running a 1x10 for a race bike. None of the courses that I race on require really low gear, so I'm able to keep things simple and lighten things up with a 1x10. This bike is 24.75 pounds, and I've got the Stan's ETR Crest wheels. Both rotors are 160, got an RP23, and again I run a carbon bar on this bike with a flip stem. So that's the setup of the bikes. Now let me talk about the performance. The first thing I want to say is when I first got on a RIP 9, I was really impressed by how agile the bike is. It feels just as agile as a 26er. So the 9er RIP 9 combines characteristics of a 26er and a 29er better than any bike I've ever ridden. And when I came time to get a trail bike, I test rode a Giant Trans X, which I've owned in the past and really loved the bike. And when I got on the bike, you know, it felt really good, and I was really ready to buy it. And then I test rode the 9er RIP 9. And when I got on the RIP 9, it had that just maintaining momentum, rolling over things that 29ers have without giving up the nimbleness that you typically get in a 26er. As far as climbing, I had mentioned before about the traction that you get on this bike. And this bike really maintains momentum, especially noticed on rougher climbs. And I do not feel this bike slowing you down on climbs. You know, people talk about 26ers, the fact that they accelerate quicker, but there's a flip side to that, and they also decelerate quicker. So when you hit objects like roots and rocks, a 26er is going to be slowed down by those more than a 29er. And when you're climbing on this bike, it really maintains momentum and gets really good traction on the climbs. And on the descents, this is probably the smoothest bike that I've ridden on descents. And my last bike was a Pivot Mach 5, and that was probably the best bike that I've ever ridden up until the 9er RIP 9. I don't have the bike anymore, and I have not been able to ride them back to back, but this bike is incredibly smooth and incredibly stable. Another really great thing about the 9er RIP 9 is its stiffness. Now, I'm not a real heavy guy, so I don't flex bikes that much, but when I go back and forth between this bike and my Giant Anthem X29er, I really notice a difference in the stiffness. And that stiffness gives this bike a lot of precision when going around corners, especially on the downhills when you're carrying more speed. So let me conclude this review with some final thoughts on the RIP 9. First, this bike is very flexible. You can build it light. You could probably get this bike around 26 pounds and use it for endurance racing, and it'd be really competitive. On the flip side, you can build it with a 140mm travel fork, beefy tires, you know, some low gearing, and make it a real all-mountain bike. I started off with a clean slate when I came time to buy this bike, because I wanted to ride the best trail bike I could get, 26er or 29er. Now, I wasn't, you know, committed to a 29er as far as my trail bike, but after riding some 26ers and then jumping on this bike, it was a no-brainer as far as what I wanted to ride for a trail bike. So the 9er RIP 9, in my opinion, is one of the best trail bikes on the market today, 26er or 29er. And I really believe over the next few years we're going to see longer travel 29ers, 120mm to 140mm of travel, dominate the trail bike scene. I think that manufacturers are really going to tweak the geometry for the longer travel 29ers, and I think that more people are going to get a chance to ride these bikes and realize just the stability and the smoothness that you get from a 29er. So I hope you enjoyed watching the video. I hope you maybe learned something about this bike or longer travel 29ers. So thanks for watching, and ride safe.